Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Passages Pulse. At the time of this recording, it is Wednesday, June 25th, 2025. It is about 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Once again, my name is Sebastian, and I'm here with my colleague and co-host, Josiah McGee. How you doing, Josiah?
I'm doing very well. Getting
Well,
some more sleep finally, which is nice.
right. Baby update. Baby's doing okay.
All good. Had healthy
Shout out
checkup, and we're very happy that everything's going well.
shout out to you, baby. I hope that they put this podcast in his ear so he can start learning from you
Learning
and
by
identifying your
osmosis.
voice.
Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad that you're back here, that you're able to be with us because like big stuff has been happening. Last week, we were talking about the war with Iran, and we speculated whether or not the United States would join and get involved. Well, this week we know that the United States did get involved,
Mm-hmm.
and boy, did they. Israel and Iran supposedly then quickly after that reached a ceasefire, which is kind of holding as of right now, again, Wednesday, 11 a.m., June 2025. So this is the perfect opportunity to reflect on what is already being called the 12th Day War. I think Trump was the first one to brand it that, of course, marketing guy. So we're going to talk about in this episode for all of you listening, what did the uh, war accomplish? What does the ceasefire mean, and what comes next? If you have any questions, please drop them in the comments because we would love to address them as we move forward. We are truly living in historic times. You guys are witnessing history. None of us, none of us. I didn't, Josiah didn't, a lot of Passages alumni didn't experience the 6 Day War. And this is truly historic. So let's get started. Josiah, I have a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
Is it pronounced Miga or Maiga?
Mika or Mike? I have no idea.
Is it Make Iran Great Again? How is it pronounced? Just kidding. That was a joke.
Yep.
The joke
You
of the
should
day.
ask someone else because that's not my wheelhouse.
Well, let's talk about, for real now, about the US attack. What led to the choice that the President of the United States made to finally give the order to attack Iran?
Yeah, I think last week we were speculating about whether or not the U.S. was going to get involved or not. It was pretty obvious at that point that Israel thought the U.S. should get involved, that the Israel wanted the U.S. to get involved. And there were some early indications that President Trump was leaning in that direction. If you'll remember last episode, we were already making note of, or the world was becoming more aware of the fact that President Trump was having these meetings or these conversations. He was moving military hardware into the Middle East that would be necessary in order to carry out a large bombing raid in Iran. So there already were these early indicators, but I think the things that were maybe slowing him down a little bit or left some room for doubt about whether the US would get involved or not was, of course, this debate over the efficacy of this bombing strategy. Would it actually work? Are these 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrators or bunker busters actually effective? Can they actually do the job of going that deep into a mountain and destroying a facility like Fordo? Do we actually have all the intelligence that we need? Do we actually have confidence that these bombers can get in and out of Iran without incident, without being detected? These were all things that it was pretty clear the administration was debating, not to mention what would be the retaliation. Were they confident that they could get in and out without causing so much of a stir that Iran would retaliate in an excessive manner and drag the US into some sort of long, prolonged war? So there was a lot of questions still. It wasn't obvious last week that the US was actually going to carry out this attack. In hindsight, if you read some of the reporting that's happening now, it seems like President Trump had probably already made his decision by the time we were recording last week, or was very close to doing so. But there was still some level of secrecy, of course, because you want to keep things quiet during the lead up to an attack like this. One of the things that has come out since some of the reporting about the attack and the immediate lead up to that attack is that President Trump was keeping it a secret or engaging in various forms of, subterfuge, deception, whatnot. But he was also coordinating with the Israelis, with the IDF. He was asking them very intentionally. The U.S. administration gave the IDF a list of air defense sites in Iran that they wanted taken out, and basically said, we're waiting until we're confident that you have accomplished enough to give us cover to carry out an attack like this without it becoming a long war. And we're waiting to have confidence that you've taken out enough of the air defense sites that these bombers can get in and out of Iran without the bombers themselves being attacked or detected. And once it became clear that Israel had done those things, then President Trump gave the go ahead and the attack was able to go forward. But there was a very deliberate process to get to that point. And again, a lot of that was happening behind the scenes, behind closed doors, of course. The decisions of this magnitude, it's not going to happen in public. It's going to happen behind closed doors. And that seems to be what was happening around the time that we were recording last week, leading up to the bombing over the weekend.
Yeah, tell us a little bit more details on the deception. What were some things that President did or the United States did to make people look the other way, literally?
Yeah, well, I mean, besides the fact that there was all this, secret coordination with Israel about a list of targets that they wanted taken out ahead of time, I think the big thing that people found really interesting was, of course, the amount of military hardware that was moved into the region, but it was moved in such a way that there were a lot of pieces in place that didn't actually wind up being used. They were probably there as cover, either as a form of deception or more likely as cover in the event that Iran decided to retaliate. They wanted a certain amount of pieces in place to protect US soldiers in the Middle East if Iran chose to retaliate in a big way. I think the thing that you're referencing or that you're trying to get at that was really interesting was they actually had multiple flights of B 2 bombers out of Missouri. You had some, presumably the ones that went to Iran.
That's not far from where you live, right? That's like
No,
two
I
hours
grew
from.
up very close to Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. You can go there. I used to go to air shows there and see the B 2 bomber flown.
Okay.
It's really cool. It's at
Wow.
Yeah, it's a big deal. Kansas City is, proud of its role in playing host adjacent to it. It's about an hour away, but close to Whiteman Air Force Base where those bombers are held. But the interesting thing that I think you're referencing, this interesting, ploy to make Iran look the other way, is that you had multiple flights of B 2 bombers going out. You had some which presumably were involved in the actual bombing. You had others which were sent to Guam. Those people were trying to figure out, okay, where are they sending the bombers? Are they going to come from the east or the west? And it was intentional, I think, to add a little bit of confusion and uncertainty about when or if the US was actually going to bomb or not.
Yeah, I think we can call that the Jonah approach to war. Jonah was supposed to go to Nineveh. He went to Tarshish
It's
instead.
went the opposite
he
direction. Yeah.
they went
There you go.
to Guam, but
Yep.
really the real guys. Of course, these are stealth bombers. Like the whole point is that they should not be tracked. So when they were being tracked, like okay, they're being tracked because they want you to they want you to track them. But the other thing also, like little things like President Trump allegedly was meeting with Steve Bannon, I think Saturday before the operation took place, or maybe Friday night, I forget, giving people the impression this is one of the guys who's been very opposed to increased military action, and so he was giving people signs like, oh look, he's meeting with a isolationist or a restrainer, but instead president had already made a decision, and
Yep.
it's truly a stroke of genius. I think us as Americans, we should be very proud of the capacity of the ability of our military people. Thank God for these warriors. This one of them, I think at least one of them was a female pilot. So this is really, really incredible to see what our country is capable of doing. So um, before we move on to the next thing of how successful was it and what exactly did they do, anything else on the decision leading up to the choice? Mm.
No, I think once it became clear that President Trump wanted to go ahead, it just became a matter of waiting for the right time to get the aircraft in and out. And you have to remember, you're not just talking about B 2s, you're also trying to think about, you know, building a land bridge, or not a land bridge, actually, it's an air bridge of refueling tankers so that you can
Right.
refuel so many stops along the way without having to land these B 2 bombers on their way to Iran and back safely to Missouri. So it, I don't want to get bogged down in this, but I do think it is worth appreciating, to your point, the quality of and the competency of the US military, that this was not a simple operation. It was actually a very complicated logistical operation. And it's not like, President Trump just snapped his fingers and then immediately the bombers take off. It's like, no, it takes time to plan an operation of this size and this magnitude and to do it as successfully as it was executed. And I don't mean necessarily in terms of the targets that were attacked. I mean just the simple fact that these bombers were able to leave Missouri, fly to Iran undetected, without tipping off any Iranian air defense systems, no shots fired at these bombers, and then they fly all the way back to Missouri without landing safely. That in and of itself is just an
Incredible.
incredible accomplishment for the U.S. military, and it's worth noting that that's why you see it take time sometimes for these operations to unfold. They're not just going to happen with a snap of a finger.
Yeah, and to synchronize this so that when the B 2 bombers arrive from Missouri, the assets in the region, like the other fighter jets, take off and they land at the same. I mean, they arrive at the same time, and then the missiles coming from the submarines also. It's all perfectly coordinated, so it's incredible. Thank God for that. One last thing on this decision is that if a single American had been killed, or if a base would have been truly attacked, we'll get to that. This would have been really bad for Trump. This would have been like, oh yeah, you did that, but at what cost? Israel would have been attacked. It would have given the anti-Semites so much fuel. But thank God that he was able to do this, and not a single American was hurt. So tell us now, what exactly did the U.S. do? What was the operation, and how successful was it?
Yeah, so the operation in terms of we've teased a bit about what happened, but haven't actually named exactly what happened yet.
Right.
So there was a few things that happened. One, so there was a group of B-2 bombers that we've referenced already. They flew into Iran, and they're the ones who attacked Fordo. They dropped, most reports indicate, 6 of these 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrators or bunker buster bombs. It was a synchronized or coordinated bombing run, essentially, in which you drop one. You probably need to drop a couple more close together in order to actually not just penetrate the earth, but then have an explosive that is able to detonate after it has burrowed so deep into the ground or whatnot. So it takes more than one of these bunker buster bombs to actually burrow into a mountain and finish the job. You can see in some of the photos, for example, that there's a grouping, a fairly tight grouping of holes in the ground where these bombs were dropped, actually. So that's one of the key things that happened. This was at the Fordo site that everyone was worried about. Is Israel
We'll
not
try
being
to
able
attach
to?
a video. There is a video of animation that shows how these bombs work. So if
Yeah,
we'll have the producer Lindsay attach this if we can. But I heard as many as 12 bombs. I know that I've heard different reports, so we don't know exactly how many, right?
it's yeah, it's a little unclear. I haven't been able to get definitive information about exactly how many bombs were dropped, but I think the point is that you're dropping the biggest bomb that the U.S. has, first and foremost.
Right,
And what you're doing
and
is
that nobody else has.
right in an attempt to burrow underground and then destroy a facility that's buried deep underground. And this was a site that Israel knew it could not destroy by itself, and that's why it was asking for U.S. assistance. And they they executed what looks to be a very successful operation using the B-2 bombers and dropping these bombs. This is the first time that these have been used in a wartime scenario, actually, not just tested. So that's a really big deal. The operation was a little bit more complex than that, though. I mean, that just by itself would have been very impressive. But speaking of coordination and synchronization, part of what the US also did is that they launched about 30 Tomahawk missiles from a submarine also in the Middle East, which were launched shortly after the bombs were dropped, it sounds like, so that they were not tipping off Iran to the fact that there was about to be an attack. And they attacked 2 other facilities, Isfahan and Natanz, which have a combination of above ground and underground facilities as well. So what the US claims to have done is dropped, a large number of at least several of these 30,000-pound bombs in Fort Doe, as well as attacking Isfahan's and Natanz with Tomahawk missiles, and then leaving before Iran could fire a shot in return. That is the basic summary of what the U.S. operation involved last week and what was essentially accomplished. Now, in terms of how successful it was, I think that's a little bit less clear. There's been a lot of debate over that recently, actually, and we'll put in the show notes some information about this, some different assessments about how successful these were. There was a report that came out this week from the Defense Intelligence Agency that seemed to suggest, Iran was set back maybe a few months. other U.S. intelligence agencies and Israeli intelligence believes that Iran was actually set back several years in terms of how far back the nuclear program was set. President Trump, when he initially announced the operation, claimed that he had obliterated the Iranian nuclear facilities.
Obliterated, yeah.
Right. And since then, I think people have kind of walked that back a little bit and said, okay, maybe that word is not quite the right word to use in relation to this operation or as a most accurate descriptor. What seems to be a little bit more accurate is that they buried the facilities. Now, the reason why there's questions about how successful it was is there's at least 400 kilograms of a already 60% enriched uranium that is currently unaccounted for. It's not clear if that was in the facilities when they were bombed and essentially buried, or if it had been moved somewhere else, and if Iran still has access to that. It's not actually totally clear at a place like Fordow how much damage was done underground. It's clear that the facility was essentially buried and you can't access it right now, but it's not clear if all of the equipment that was buried underneath that mountain was actually destroyed because the best assessment that you have right now from an intelligence standpoint is satellite photos. We don't actually have the ability to see inside the mountain. So it is a little bit unclear exactly how much damage was done at a place like Fordow. I think what's safer to say is that the program was not obliterated per se, but it is currently out of reach. So,
Yeah.
in order for Iran to rebuild their uranium enrichment facilities, they would have to dig them out from underneath the mountain or dig through the rubble and find what they need in order to do so. And that leaves it out of reach of the Iranian program. And in that respect, I do think it's probably safe to say, contrary to that one intelligence assessment, which, by the way, was issued with quote unquote low confidence, I think they're more than a few months away from rebuilding a nuclear weapon and then breaking out to a bomb again. I think they probably are more like a few years away because you have to dig everything out and start over essentially if you're going to restart this nuclear program. That being said, I do think it is important to clarify that technically Iran could do so. And Iran has already issued statements. Their nuclear officials have already made statements that they intend to rebuild their nuclear program. And it wasn't destroyed so completely that they can't do that. It's just going to take them some time. And at this point, the good news is the US and Israel have the ability to at least see it coming and have more advanced notice if they were to try to do that.
Yeah. So little comment on that unaccounted for uranium. I so this morning at the NATO summit, President Trump was meeting with some European leaders, and he said that the Israelis went in and they confirmed the damage. I think he probably spoke out of turn there, and the Israelis were like, "Nope, we didn't do that." Here's what I think. I heard this from the Commentary podcast, Commentary magazine. I think the leader of this commentary is
Mhm.
John Bodor or something like that. He said something that I really think is very interesting. We've seen satellite images of a convoy of trucks leaving the area. Israel has eyes all over Iran, and they've been able to target whatever they wanted. They saw those trucks leaving, and they didn't target them. So here is the theory. The theory is that there's a chance. Here's what I'm trying to be responsible here, but I want to say to our audience, there's a chance that maybe what happened is that the Israelis were the ones who got the uranium out. Those trucks were Israeli or like Mossad agents or whatever, and Israel has it because Prime Minister Netanyahu on Monday they asked him after the attack during the press conference, and he kind of laughed. He was like little coy about it. He was like, "We know where it is. We got it." So there's a chance that actually Israel coordinated with some collaborators, and Israel, they're like I said, my biggest argument here is that there was a trucks that were leaving, and Israel didn't do anything about it when the Israel could have done something about it. So I think Israel is not going to let Iran just use this uranium. I think they know where it is or they have it.
I mean, I do think that Israeli intelligence feels fairly confident that they have some idea of where it is. There's been some reports even today, however, from various journalists like Nadav Ayal, who is a very respected journalist in Israel. He tweeted something this morning about Israeli intelligence estimates being that most of the 400 kilograms is buried either in Natanz or Fordow or
Right.
one of those locations that the U.S. bombed and buried under rubble. So I don't think It's an interesting theory that Israel just drove off with the uranium and they're hiding it somewhere. I think if it were that easy to get in and out of Fordo and steal that much enriched uranium material, then they could have destroyed Fordo by themselves. There was no
True.
reason why the US had to bomb Fordo in that instance. They could have just laid explosives and destroyed the facility. So I don't think Israel
Yeah.
has the uranium. I do think there's good reason to believe that Israel knows where it is and is
Right.
not overly concerned about it. But that is the point, I think, in having this conversation is to just make sure that all the facts are out there and people understand that there is an important caveat to the success of this operation is that yes, the facilities were mostly rendered inoperable or hard to reach, and Iran can't reach them without, you know, raising some red flags and people knowing that they're trying to reach those facilities and rebuild them. That doesn't necessarily mean that there is, zero danger of Iran producing some nuclear material or continuing to rebuild a nuclear program in the future, because somewhere in Iran that material does more than likely still exist.
Yeah, yeah. So just to clarify further the facts, CNN, I think, were the ones who reported that based on intelligence they got from sources at the Pentagon that they have only delayed Iran's to the bomb by months. So that's what they said. But like you highlighted, I don't think they're taking into account just the destruction of Fordo is one thing, but also just the whole infrastructure that you need to create a bomb. You need a warhead, you need a missile. Israel bombed a lot of that. You need scientists. Israel, I think, killed like 19 scientists, something like that. Israel has truly, I think, bought themselves years, and thank God for that. But the threat is still here, which we'll get into in a second.
Yeah.
So now I want to ask you about the Iranian response. Before I tell you that, I want to tell you some of the things that people were saying before this attack. The fear that of America getting involved by people like Tucker Carlson, for instance. He said that thousands of Americans will die and tens of billions of dollars will be at stake here in cost. He said that this strike would trigger World War III and it will destroy President Trump's presidency. He said that the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, will get involved, and it will be a global retaliation that the people who advocate for this strike are enemies of the American people. I'm almost done. There's another guy who's a comedian, but he has a really loud profile. Dave Smith, he said that this will lead to World War with Russia, China, and Turkey, that it will collapse the American economy, that gas will go up to 30 gallons, $30 per gallon. This will be more disastrous than our war with Iraq, that it will be the final blow. This is the craziest thing that he said, I think. This will be the final blow to the American empire. If America did this, this will be the end of the American empire. So this is what people were saying. Some people were saying before America got involved. So what was the Iranian response, Josiah?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting you bring all that up. I think there was certainly a lot of alarms being raised about the prospect of a US bombing campaign and the potential response. I think there was a couple things that were happening in immediate aftermath that made it clear that things probably were not going to be quite as bad as people had perhaps projected or predicted them to be. One of them is the fact that Iran briefly thought about shutting down the Strait of Hormuz, which is a key area in which a lot of international shipping passes. There's a very narrow choke point or bottleneck that Iran controls. And if you had been able to effectively close it off, then they would have been able to basically prevent the majority of the world's oil from reaching its international destinations. People thought that that was going to be a big deal, that that was going to be one of the first things that Iran tried to do, which is part of why people claiming things like there's going to be this big war over oil and there's going to be gas prices going crazy high and this and that. But I think one thing that people didn't appreciate enough is that one of the biggest clients of Iran's oil industry is China. China is actually very dependent on oil coming out of Iran and through that strait. And China almost immediately told Iran, don't do that. it, the country that's going to be hurt most by Iran taking a retaliatory move like that is not the United States, certainly not Israel, who's not buying any oil from Iran. It's China. So it was almost immediately pretty clear that that wasn't actually going to be an effective strategy for Iran to pursue, and they didn't do anything more than sort of play with the idea. I don't think. Now, in terms of what Iran did do, they chose to respond to the United States directly via an air base in Qatar. So basically, Iran launched a handful of missiles. I think it was about 10, 9 of which were intercepted. One fell in an open area. And they were launched at an air base that the US leases from Qatar in Qatari territory. So this was not a small thing. I mean, it's 10 missiles being launched at an air base controlled by the US military, in which a large percentage of the US aircraft in the Middle East are housed on a semi-permanent basis as they rotate through the region. So that's a big deal. You know, it's not a small thing that they did that. What made it very interesting, however, is that they telegraphed in advance and they choreographed in advance exactly what was going to happen. So, and
And
President
Trump thanked them for it.
Right. President Trump went so far as to thank them and said, "Thank you for telling us, giving us advance warning so that we could evacuate personnel, move aircraft to a safe space, and so that there would be no injuries or deaths to American service members." So it was pretty obvious given that, and the Qataris confirmed this too, they condemned the attack, but they also acknowledged that Iran had coordinated with them, given them advance notice of it's going to be here, it's not going to be in a city, in Qatar, it's going to be the airbase only at this time. And it gave both the Qataris and the Americans time to deal with it and to prepare themselves and to make sure that it would be an attack that didn't actually do any damage either to US military equipment or to any US military personnel or to anyone in Qatar, any Qatari people as well. Most analysts believe, and because of this core coordination and choreographing that took place ahead of time, Iran meant for it to be a very symbolic event. It wasn't meant to actually do any damage. They had no real interest in further escalating this war with the US and being drawn into this long conflict. They needed to respond in order to save face, but they wanted to do so in such a way that they had an out, an off ramp quickly after, and that the US wouldn't immediately, bomb Tehran afterwards. So that seems to be what happened. And I think where people miscalculated is that people thought that Iran wanted, this big war with the United States. And President Trump's calculation was the opposite, that Israel had done so much damage to Iran over the previous week plus of attacks that the Iranians were actually looking for a way out, the Iranians. And he felt that he could, bomb these facilities. Iran probably would respond, but in a fairly small manner. And then everyone would be able to walk away from it and say it's time for the war to end. And that is what President Trump really was arguing from the beginning, even at the beginning of the war, when he was making the argument that I might launch a bombing raid in Iran. I might not. I might attack Iran. I might not. But if I do, it's going to be the end of the war. It's not going to be the beginning of this long war. It's going to be the end of the war. And it seems that that's why President Trump was confident in the ability to attack when he did without a major Iranian response, is because he was confident the Iranians were weak enough. They were ready to end the war. All he needed to do was, bomb a few facilities and convince the Israelis and the rest of the world that Iran's nuclear program had been set back, and then he could make a credible case that everyone is ready for this war to be over. And that's why I think you also saw a push for a ceasefire very quickly after.
Yeah, I want to say two things about the response. Once, like, of course, the response from Iran shows how weak they were. They were truly humiliated, truly like um, destroyed by Israel as far as military accomplishments go. I want to highlight. I don't know if we did it last week. I think a lot of you guys know, but just to get the facts straight, in the first hour of this conflict, Israel was able to eliminate the head of the IRGC, the head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, the chief of staff of the army, the head of the air force, the head of intelligence. Then they replaced the head of the intelligence. They got rid of them again. Then the head of the air defense, the head of lately, the latest people that they got rid of were the head of the Quds Force Palestinian Corps, meaning the person in charge of arming Hamas and making sure that Palestinian terrorists destroy Israel. That person was taken out. And they have receipts, emails of like letters between Yahya Sinwar and this guy, giving him millions of dollars to support terrorist attacks. And then they get the head of smuggling. And then Israel did a bunch of other things, but it just shows that Israel was able to accomplish a lot in the first hour. And the second thing I wanted to say about this is Qatar is still a troublesome frenemy of the United States. I know the President Trump is very grateful that they invested millions of dollars here, maybe a trillion, I think. But this is not okay. Like our friend in the region is pretty much a friend of our biggest enemy. Uh, that's not okay. I think we still need to reevaluate as an American government, as American people, our relationship with Qatar. They are playing both sides here. They're the they're the arsonists who put out the fire. Um, just like Iran has been sponsoring terrorism in the region, Qatar has been doing the same. But the only difference is that Qatar lets us have an force base in their country and they give us millions of dollars in the economy. But Qatar is not our friend. I just want everybody to be reminded of that. So I'm still very uncomfortable with our relationship with Qatar. Uh, Anything else you want to say before I move on to the next section?
No, go for it.
All right. So we talked about what led up to the decision. We talked about what they did. We talked about what Iran did in response. So now let's talk about what did the Israel and the United States accomplish? What is actually the tangible outcomes of this operation, of the 12-day war, Josiah?
Yeah, so if you want to just look at some numbers, I guess, in terms of what was accomplished, and Sebastian, you may have your favorite numbers too that you think are most interesting, but I'll just start with a few that I think are interesting. It's interesting that they didn't just go after the nuclear facilities. So we'll get to that in a second again. I just want to remind everyone sort of where Iran stands now as far as its nuclear program. But before that, the ballistic missile program is also a very major threat, not just to Israel, but to the region, to US service members in the region, to other countries in the Middle East. So it's very significant, I think, what was accomplished there. You have somewhere about 2/3, I think, of their launchers were destroyed. You have somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 of their missiles either depleted or destroyed by Israel during the course of the war. So if you start with somewhere between 2,000, 2,500 missiles, you're left with about maybe 1,000 left. So less than half of the ballistic missile stock that they had previously, and only a third of the launchers that they had previously. So that's a big deal. It doesn't mean that they totally destroyed the program, but they did do, I think, some significant damage to Iran's ballistic missile program, which, with or without a nuclear warhead, is a big deal and was posing a significant threat to the rest of the Middle East. So I think that's a major accomplishment. I do think it is also a very major accomplishment the degree to which they're able to degrade the command and control structure of Iran, or also the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which we discussed last week. And Sebastian just gave a few examples of some names. Thank you for that. But it's really significant. I mean, there are estimates that on the first night alone, the number of officers which held a rank of brigadier general or higher, excuse me. I can't even pronounce the words right now. A brigadier general or higher. It's insane. I mean, the numbers out there are just astonishing in terms of you're not just going after low-ranking officers. You're decapitating the highest ranks of the Iranian military multiple times during the course of this 12-day war. So that is also, I think, important because it leads to a lack of clear and effective strategy. Iran has been able to sustain itself through various wars of attrition over the years because it held a very clear doctrine, military doctrine, had very clear strategy, and it had a lot of buy-in to that strategy, a lot of people who were very smart helping build that strategy. A lot of those people are now out of the picture. So that's also a very important accomplishment, I think, for Israel and the United States. Maybe one of the reasons why Iran was willing to go for a ceasefire right now is because they don't have the people necessary to help them strategize effectively right now and come up with a response. When it comes to the nuclear program, I think there is some ambiguity. We talked about this in the beginning of the conversation, so I don't want to belabor the point, but I think the best way to summarize this is it was set back significantly. It was probably set back by a few years, according to most estimates, with one or two people or agencies sort of disagreeing or dissenting. Most would agree it was set back probably by a few years or significantly rendered inoperable. That being said, it wasn't totally destroyed. So there is, I think, again, some ambiguity, some uncertainty, lack of clarity about exactly how far back was it set, exactly how much work would Iran have to do in order to put the pieces back together. It's definitely clear that Iran still has the minimum required for a nuclear program. I mean, it could rebuild a nuclear program if it wanted to. It just won't be able to make it into a weapon nearly as fast as it would have been able to a few weeks ago. The last thing I want to mention that I think is an encouraging sign. Some people I think are going to hear they're going to hear the fact that Iran could build a nuclear program back and think, "But that's really scary. I mean, what was all this about if they still have the ability to put the pieces back together?" Fair question. A word that I think I want to remind everyone or give everyone in response to that is Israel also accomplished a lot in terms of establishing air superiority. Let's not forget the fact that up until the ceasefire, Israeli jets were flying over Iran at will, or at the very
Yeah.
least the western half. The eastern half, there probably is still some work to be done in gaining the level of air superiority that they have in western Iran. But over half of the country of Iran, Israeli jets can fly in and out without any issues. There were no pilots lost, no airplanes lost during the last 12 days. And that is amazing, an amazing accomplishment for Israel. And again, same thing was true of the US group that flew into Iran, bombed the facilities, and then flew back out without being detected. That's an amazing level of air superiority. So even in the event that, let's say, 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, there's some evidence that Iran is trying to dig out some of the pieces from the rubble, put back together a nuclear program, it would be very easy as long as we remain vigilant and Israel remains vigilant. It should remain very easy for those sorts of developments to be handled in the future, provided Israel and the United States are intentional about maintaining a certain level of air superiority and the ability to fly in and out of Iran when necessary in order to deal with those problems.
Yeah. I'm really impressed by all of this. It's incredible what Israel's been able to accomplish. Iran, just to remind everybody, has spent the last 3 decades building proxies around Israel to eliminate Israel through proxy wars. So they armed the Houthis, they armed the Hezbollah, they armed Hamas. So they've been creating this ring of fire around Israel, and we've seen how Israel was able to eliminate Hezbollah's ability to do anything, and also taking away their will to fight. Hezbollah still has weapons, they still have soldiers, they still have missiles, but they said, and when this war began, they were like, "We're not going to get involved." And Iran armed them for this reason to be able to create another front for Israel. But
Yeah.
Israel has taken away their will to fight. So what I think is incredible is that Israel has turned Iran into Hezbollah. Israel can go into Lebanon today, fly unimpeded. They just did that, I think, last week. Like, take away, they have a ceasefire such that agreement with the Lebanese government that Israel can go in, or Israel actually lets the Lebanese government know when they detect something that is a violation of the ceasefire. So the Lebanese army is supposed to take it out. But if they don't, Israel has the right to come in and deal with it. Israel has just done that with Iran. I think we're going to see that if Israel sees something that it becomes dangerous for Israel, they're just going to go and deal with it. So it's incredible. But I think it's really sad for the Iranian people as well. They have seen they're one of the richest countries on paper because of their oil reserves. But their people are starving. People are hungry in the streets. Last winter was really difficult for people there who were freezing because the energy rich country does not have enough energy to keep their people warm, and they have seen how they spend billions of dollars creating this nuclear program that Israel has just destroyed. And what do they say after it's over? We're going to go do it again. And the losers here are the Iranian people. So we'll see if they're going to rise up. We'll talk about this at the end. What are the next things? As far as numeric results, I want to highlight some things from Israel. 28 people died as a result of these missiles coming through. 27 civilians, and one was the last person who died was a off-duty soldier, 18-year-old soldier who was in Beersheba. And I think this was so tragic. This was a beautiful young couple. His girlfriend was killed too. They were in the bomb shelter, but the missile struck directly in the bomb shelter, and it's not meant to withstand that. So about 3,000, I've seen numbers as high as 4,000 Israelis have been injured in some way or another. Um, but of course, this is terrible. 28 people dying, especially this young 18-year-old couple dying. They were not married; they were dating. But I'm gonna say something very careful. 28 people died over 14 days, 12 days. Sorry, that's probably a number of people that die anyways, just from other things. Of course, these people were killed. It's different. They didn't just die of natural causes; they were murdered. But it's historic. I heard one commentator say that this is the first war in at least the last century, the last 2 centuries, that one side of the war didn't lose a single soldier. Israel didn't lose a single soldier that was fighting. Of course, they lost one soldier that was at home
Yeah.
by the missile, but not a single soldier was lost. That's in, and America, of course, didn't lose a single soldier either. Another impressive things is about interceptors. 90% of missile interception accomplished. So, of course, 10% got through, and look what they were able to do. It's really uh, damaging, the damage that's been done to homes. But 99% of drones were intercepted. So, is Iran launched around 500 drones? Only one got through, and he went into an open area with no injuries in Beishan. So I want. Why do I say this? Because I want Americans to be aware that these interceptors cost a lot of money. They cost millions of dollars overall to be able. I think the Iron Dome, it needs two interceptors to neutralize one rocket. That costs $100,000. And then there's the David arrow, the sling. These things are very, very expensive, and that's part of what America does to give Israel money, our ally, who clearly, obviously, is at the front line of the war on terror. And I think we should be proud of that. We should be grateful that the American government is involved in giving Israel what they need financially to protect their citizens. Uh, this would have been a terrific massacre of Jewish people, the only Jewish state surrounded by millions of Arabs who have risen up to destroy Israel at one time or another in history. And we should be proud that America is the one country giving Israel money to defend themselves, to protect their civilians. So thank God for that. Um, a lot more that we could say about the results of this, but let's keep it moving because we want to talk about now. So what now? President Trump announced a ceasefire, and apparently it's taking hold right now. Tell us about this ceasefire, Josiah, and what's the likelihood of it holding?
It's a strange ceasefire. I think people are. I saw a meme somewhere that was really interesting, or a Twitter post. The idea that, yeah, it seems as if President Trump thinks that he can unilaterally declare a ceasefire, almost the same way that Michael Scott would declare bankruptcy,
Love that.
which is funny, but it's also it it does describe, I think, some of the confusion people have about how did this happen exactly. Did he just decide there was going to be a ceasefire and then said it, or did he actually talk to the two sides? I think he did talk to the two sides. I don't think he just unilaterally declared a ceasefire. So there was obviously some conversation going on, and there are some reports suggesting that, the Qataris, for example, are or have played a role in sort of passing messages back and forth between Israel and Iran, or the U.S. and Iran, about the prospects for a ceasefire, and making sure everyone's on the same page, so everyone's ready for something like this. So I don't think it was just a unilateral announcement. That being said, there is some ongoing, I think, confusion about what does this ceasefire actually mean, because all President Trump really announced was that there's going to be a complete ceasefire at this time. Iran's going to stop shooting first, then Israel, and by this time, nobody should be shooting at either side of this war. Supposedly, it was unconditional. There was no mention of any specific conditions or terms of the agreement in terms of, what happens after you stop shooting. Is there going to be negotiations after? I will say that as of this morning, there are reports coming out of various news outlets, especially in Israel, that President Trump has made some sort of announcement that there will be talks next week about, okay, now what?
Yes.
So that's what I think people were waiting for. Initially, when the ceasefire was announced, it was very confusing. What does that mean? It seems like what it means is he was just waiting for everyone to stop shooting. And then the plan was to convince people to come to the table next week and start negotiating the details about the future. Is Iran actually going to finish the process of dismantling its nuclear program? Is it going to turn over this enriched uranium that people are still trying to figure out where is it and in what shape is this material? Is Iran going to agree to any sort of controls of its ballistic missile program, which, of course, the US and Israel would like to see? So, all of those details and questions that people I think had about the ceasefire, it sounds like they're still to be negotiated or discussed at a later time, sometime next week. As of the time we're recording, that is the best information that we have available to share as far as what's being reported. In terms of whether the ceasefire will hold, I think it's a really interesting question because it didn't do great in the first few hours. You know, it was okay leading up to it. It's what you would expect. Both Iran and Israel, trying to get in your best last shot at the enemy. So there's massive volleys of missiles from Iran, a large number of airstrikes from Israeli jets in Iran, trying to do as much damage as you can before the ceasefire starts. And it makes sense. That's the way ceasefires usually work, is you try to squeeze out every last ounce of, military success that you can before you have to stop shooting. No surprises there. What I think did surprise people is that there was some dissension about the timeline. So President Trump announced a timeline, and Iran said something else about what they thought the timeline was for the ceasefire starting and claimed that it was something else entirely. Eventually, that kind of got worked out. But even after that, after it was clear that Iran had stopped shooting and it was in a ceasefire state, a few hours after that, Iran still launched another missile into northern Israel. And that was viewed as a violation of the ceasefire, like clear, undeniable violation of the ceasefire. So Israel, in response, then felt like it had to respond. And it did. It took out, I think, a radar station in Iran, a pretty symbolic target. I mean, it wasn't anything crazy, but that was probably less than what they would have liked to take out. I think the reason why it was a symbolic target and not an actual retaliation is because President Trump was insistent the ceasefire had to hold. He wasn't going to let it fall apart in the first 3 to 4 hours after it took place. And so he was pretty firm, actually, and basically posted something on Truth Social saying, Israel, bring those jets home now. Like,
Yeah.
to turn those planes around and send them home. It's time for this to be over. I want a ceasefire. And was publicly demanding that Israel basically, respect the ceasefire other than attacking this one symbolic target in response to Iran's violation. So I think it, for now, seems to be holding. There haven't been any incidents since that in the first few hours of the ceasefire, at least nothing that would be of significant alarm or cause for concern. It still seems tenuous. It could fall apart. I mean, it's a ceasefire. It's not a permanent agreement for peace between Iran and Israel, and it's only a couple days old. So it's early to be making predictions about the future, about how long this could hold. There are any number of scenarios in which war could resume if Israel feels like Iran is trying to, dig out those facilities that were buried. If Israel feels like Iran is, doing something aggressive, like prepping missile launchers again to launch at Israel again in the future, or any number of things. If the negotiations fall apart and Iran decides that it's time to, resume the war because the U.S. is making demands that it won't accept about the future of its nuclear program, that could all mean a return to the war in the future. But these are hypotheticals that right now it's just a little bit too early to be obsessing over because you just don't know. I mean, it's a 2-day-old ceasefire at this point, so you need to give it some more time, I think, to determine whether it will hold or not. Obviously, we hope that it will, and that the talks next week can be fruitful and productive and take place in an environment where the temperature has been lowered a little bit by the ceasefire. That's the ideal scenario, and that's, I think, what we would, hope for moving forward.
Yeah, I want to bring in here a little article that I read that I think is interesting. I think it could help our audience think something here as far as Iran goes. So, it's an article published in April by the National Review. The National Review is a conservative magazine. They have a podcast as well. They're not fans of Trump. They're actually very critical of President Trump. They're very conservative, fiscally conservative, and they don't think Trump is fiscally conservative enough. So that aside, they had an Iranian academic write an article. His name is Shai Kotiri. He wrote an article how Iran's regime was built on a three-legged stool. The three legs on which the regime stands: one is Islamic law, the second one, and economic justice. The second one sorry, the first one is Islamic law, the second one is economic justice, and the third one is anti-American or anti-Zionist foreign policy.
Mhm.
So what is he was doing this 2 months ago. He said at this moment, the first leg is broken. Secularism is rising. So this Islamic law that they're trying to create is not working because people, since the regime has been using religion to oppress them, people have been turning secular. Mosques are closing. Hijab defiance is rising and public Islam is hollowed out. People are not very much into, as a majority goes. I think only like 20, maybe less percentage of the people actually support the regime. So the first leg is broken. The Islamic law is not working. Second, the economic leg. There is elite corruption. There is mass poverty. There is fuel outages. The regime loyalists feel betrayed. So economically, they're not doing well. And the third one, their foreign policy of being the Shia. This is another dynamic that I think our passengers alumni should understand. One of the arguments that the Ayatollah is making is those Sunni Muslims were not able to destroy Israel, but we, the true Muslim, the Shia Muslim, we're going to be the ones to get the job done that the Sunnis were not able to do. Well, that's not looking very good right now. Hezbollah is crippled, Gaza is devastated, the proxies are losing. So, what is their last hope? So, their three legged stool is broken, so their last hope is nuclear weapons to show their strength and to show to the people that we still got this. So I think they're still gonna go for it. They're upset about this, and it's really sad that the losers here are the Iranian people. Do you have any other questions as far as the ceasefire? What are some lingering questions that remain after this ceasefire?
I think it's a laundry list, and it'll be interesting to see where we come back to in the next few weeks. We would love to get back to other subjects that also are important besides the Iran war, like what's happening in Gaza, for example. I think there's just been a lot of sort of attention turned away from that during the course of the last 12 days with the Iran war, but it still matters. It's still important. So, of course, we'll try to get back to that. We will, I think, need to continue to monitor and keep an eye on what's happening in Iran, not just for the purposes of this conversation, but even just for the purposes of running trips to Israel. Like this is going to be something we have to continue to pay attention to and be aware of what's going on as an organization. So I think there's some questions that I have. Again, a long list. I'll just rattle off a few and get your reaction to them. One, where is the uranium? It's a question. People
Yes.
want to know, where is it actually? Okay, so you presumably destroyed most of the centrifuges or the equipment that was enriching the uranium, but it's still 60% enriched uranium. It's not that hard to rebuild some facilities and then use that material to get yourself to 90% enriched uranium. So until you know where the material is that has already been enriched, there's still some question marks about exactly how far away is Iran from rebuilding this program and getting
Yeah.
themselves back to the potential for a bomb. There's some
Just and I
questions.
heard a smart person say that that amount of uranium is super heavy, so it's not actually, it doesn't have a lot of volume. It's actually a small
Right.
volume. It's a very heavy thing. It's heavier than anything, but it's small, so it could be sneaked in very various ways.
Right. It's very dense. So
Right.
I heard the same report. I think was it Amit Segal maybe?
He
Someone.
said that it fits in a box.
Yeah, it's heavier than water, but it is also still very portable because it is not a large volume. So yeah, it's a question
So
mark,
that's scary.
and I think something that people want to know and understand. And there's concerns about, even if you don't complete the enrichment process, you could still use that material to do things like build dirty bombs or things of that
Yeah.
nature. So you want to know where that is. That's a big deal. I think we also want to know, what are the negotiations going to cover? What's on the table? What's not? What are the objectives that President Trump is going to try to reach or receive in return from Iran during those negotiations? And how much is he actually going to be able to get of those objectives from Iran? So those are, I think, some important questions over the next couple of weeks as those talks might begin. Is Iran going to actually try to rebuild their nuclear and missile programs? Early indications are yes. Of course, I'm sure President Trump is going to demand no during the talks. But what are they going to be cooperative or not? I mean, what's the conversation going to look like during the course of those talks? And then even down the road, will they respect any agreement that is reached? What are the enforcement mechanisms going to be for any such agreement so that it's a guarantee that Iran can't come back to the table and continue building these programs up. Again, not just the nuclear program. I'm very interested in whether the conversations and the negotiations will cover the missile program because, as this war just demonstrated, yeah, the casualty rate was not as high as it might have been in Iran, but still, the ballistic missiles proved to be fairly effective. You know, it it only 5% make it through air defenses. That doesn't sound like a lot, but if you can imagine Iran having not just 1,000 missiles, but 10,000 ballistic missiles, that's a problem. You could actually find yourself in a very dangerous situation, even if Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon in the future. So, my question is, are those weapons going to be on the table during the negotiations as well? I think they should be. Is Israel going to continue to have the freedom of action to take advantage of the air superiority that it has? Let's say in a hypothetical situation, there's some satellite images that come out that prove that Iran is trying to, dig out Fordo and find their way back into the mountain to retrieve equipment that they need or things like that. In theory, Israel has the air superiority to put a stop to that and so that it doesn't actually pose a threat in the future, but only if they are given the permission to take advantage of the fact that their military advantage is that much superior to Iran's at this point. Yeah. It only works as long as President Trump is willing to actually give Israel permission to go back into Iran in the future if worst case scenario something bad happens. But that's a question. Like, is President Trump going to be on the same page as Israel about what should be done in the event that Iran tries something and Israel feels like it, wants to take advantage of the fact that it can fly jets in and out of Iran without any harm? I mean, that's a tough question, but I think an important one. And then I think the last questions that I have, of course, are just more big picture. Like, what about Gaza? Does this mean now that President Trump is going to push for an end to the war in Gaza, same way that he really was very intentional and forceful about, I want to see an end to the war in Iran. I don't want this to drag on forever. The reason why I bombed Iran was so that the war would end. Period. Is he going to take a similar approach to Gaza? Are we going to see more pressure on Hamas and or Israel for a ceasefire deal on the Gaza Strip? How is that going to unfold? And then even bigger picture, take a look at the region. Iran is not crippled necessarily. They still have a formidable set of weapons at their disposal, but they're no longer a nuclear threat. And there's a very big difference between the Iran of today and the Iran of 12 days ago or 2 weeks ago. So, uh, one of the questions that I have is how quickly do you see things begin to shift in terms of the potential for a strategic realignment in the region? Is Iran still a regional superpower? Because prior to this, of course, the United States and China really are the two big global superpowers, and that's about it. But on a regional level, it was really, a group competing. You have Israel, you have Iran, you have the Saudis to a certain degree, Turkey, all competing for this sort of like regional superpower status. Iran is probably, at least temporarily, out of that equation in terms of its ability to become a regional superpower, especially because it does not have immediate access to a nuclear weapon. That could change in the future. But right now, let's just pretend like they're off the table. What does that mean? Are we going to see peace between Israel and the Saudis? Are we going to see more competition between Israel and companies like Saudi Arabia or Turkey over that, drive to achieve a regional superpower status or whatnot? I think in a perfect world, you would see more peace. You would see the Abraham Accords expanding very quickly. But I also think there are some questions about, okay, realistically, how are countries going to respond to the fact that Iran is not as strong as it used to be? And now there's this vacuum of power that can be filled. Who's going to fill it? How are they going to fill it? Is it going to be a cooperative process or is it going to be a competitive process? And I think there's a lot that I'm very interested to see unfolding over the next couple of years.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that we saw before the American attack on Fordo and everywhere else, and the other two locations, we saw Saudi Arabia put out a statement condemning Israel's attacks on Iran. Like out of nowhere, like a week later, they did at the beginning, and then a week later, randomly, they're like, "We just want to condemn this." But turns out that later, I think they got the heads up that America was about to do this because They're trying to distance themselves from this. They're
Mm.
trying to say, we're not going to let them use our airspace. Don't come at us. We condemn this. So what I'm highlighting this for alumni to understand that Saudi Arabia has to save face before its people. So I heard, I think it was Amit Ayal, Amit, again, just a
Amit Segal,
genius.
yeah.
Segal, sorry. The other guy is Nadaf Ayal.
Mhm.
Amit said that what we might see in the next few weeks is um, Saudi Arabia being able to sell that they were the ones who got Israel to stop the genocide in Gaza. I'm using quotes here, people who are not watching. So that's the saving face aspect for Saudi Arabia. So Israel is about to go hard in Gaza, I think, do negotiations, and when they hopefully will get a deal and this war is over, then Saudi Arabia will get to take credit for that and tell to these people, we're making normalization with Israel because we got them to stop this war on Gaza. So this is one of the things that could happen. I want to say one last thought about the war in general, and then I want to go to the Bible to finish up. So, friends, please stick with us. I have one more thing to say, and then I would encourage you to stay because I want to talk about a Bible verse that I think can be very relevant for us at this moment. Again, going back to Nadav Ayal, I think he said months ago, I think he's the one who came out with this thought. You correct me, please. He said that Israel needs to be feared by its enemies, but loved by friends in the West. So, like by the United States, by the France, Germany, the UK. And I think this war, this victory has achieved that once again for Israel. This is the type of war that helps Israel, like the Six-Day War, that they showed that they were attacked and they were able to defend themselves, and now they come out more powerful than before. The type of war that doesn't help Israel is the war in Gaza, a 2 year conflict with a lot of political things behind it. So I think this has achieved. Well, let's remember, France was leading a conference to unilaterally recognize the state of Palestine, and Saudi Arabia was supposed to show up to that, and it was canceled immediately when Israel started attacking Iran. They canceled that war. And then the chancellor of Germany, who was kind of getting critical of Israel, he said some very positive things about Israel lately and some negative things about Iran. They said that Iran cannot be allowed to have nuclear weapons. So I just wanted to highlight for our friends that this war has been has repositioned Israel as a respectable power. Their enemies fear them. Hezbollah fears them. Hamas, uh, the Houthis, and Iran, of course. But its friends, like the United States, love them. We did a podcast about Trump visiting Qatar and kind of sidelining Israel. We see here that there's no daylight between the United States and Israel at this moment. They're working closely. The president said at the end of his speech, "God bless Israel." God bless America.
Mhm.
So I think this is another dynamic that has happened, but we need to pray that the Israelis will not grow hubris. They will not grow overconfident like they did after the Six-Day War. And then they were really hurt by the Yom Kippur War, just like they did on October 7th when they had this intelligentsia mentality that they were okay, the Hamas was handled, but Hamas surprised them. So hopefully Israelis will not grow overconfident after this conflict. So that's my last commentary about the war. Any reaction to that before I go into the Bible?
No, I think that's a good comment there about, what next in terms of historical parallels, and I think the same is true for the United States. It There was a good podcast that came out. There's the Call Me Back podcast, Dan Senor, and he had both Nadav and Eyal on it, talking about the ceasefire. And part of the conversation they had was about how do you react to a war like this. And I think they made a good comment that it's important to, walk a fine line after a conflict like this. It is important to not be overly pessimistic. It's a good thing. It is a good thing for not just Israel, for the Middle East, but for the world that Iran is much farther away from a nuclear weapon than they were 2 weeks ago. You don't want to be overly pessimistic and ignore that reality. At the same time, you don't want to be so overconfident that you take your eye off the wheel or the road and you just forget the fact that Iran could in the future have us all right back here at the same spot we were 2 weeks ago, where we're having a conversation about how to prevent them from having a nuclear weapon. The job's not done yet. And I think being clear eyed and optimistic about the opportunity that is in front of the United States and Israel and the rest of the world to find a more permanent solution to this problem. Now that there's no urgent threat of Iran having a nuclear weapon in the immediate short term, there's an opportunity, but it's an opportunity that should not be wasted. And if we are not careful about that, then yeah, we could find ourselves having to solve this problem again, all over again in a few years.
Let's pray for that. Um, all right. Well, I just wanted to encourage our listeners or the people watching this with the Bible. The point of this podcast is in the intro that we want to bring biblical clarity into current events. And as this is happening, it just so happens last week, my church sets out preaching schedule months ahead, and it just so happens that the psalm we're right now doing a summer of psalms, so we're preaching through psalms every weekend. And last week, the psalm that we were supposed to preach from was Psalm 83, which is the psalm that talks about Israel being surrounded by all its enemies. And the psalmist is praying to the Lord, asking him to deal with this, to deal with Israel's enemies. So that wasn't planned. That just happened. But I would encourage you all to, this week, when you're doing your quiet time, read Psalm 83 and then read Judges 4 through 6. I want to say why. The Bible verse that I want to focus here is Psalm 83, verse 3 through 4. The psalmist is saying, they, meaning the enemies of God, the enemies of Israel, they lay crafty plans against your people. They consult together against your treasured ones. They say, come, let us wipe them out as a nation. Let the name of Israel be remembered no more. For they conspire with one accord against you and they make a covenant. So this is an incredible Bible verse because, for instance, the Romans literally did this. They wiped out the Jews from the land of Judea. They changed the name of the land. They wanted to erase the name of Israel, change the name from Judea to Palestine, to Palestina. And today, the Romans are no more as a nation. The Romans are gone, but Israel stands. Israel's still there, and I think that's a miracle by God. And the psalmist here is saying that these people are conspiring against us. They want to erase us. And if you look, the prayer continues saying, do to them what you did to Moab, to Ammon, to Amalek, to all this, to the sons of Lot. So this is not a Bible preaching podcast, but I wanted to mention this Bible verse because what the psalmist is describing is at the time of the judges, the Lord will rise up people like Gideon, Barak, Deborah, or Yael, and deal with the enemies of the Lord. One of these guys, I think his name was Jabin, he had 900 chariots. Apparently, he had 900 chariots to attack Israel, and Israel, through the Lord, through the Holy Spirit raising a judge, overwhelmingly defeated them. So I think what we saw happen during the time of Judges, what the Bible describes, is what we just saw happen again. And this happens again and again, that the enemies of God's people rise up, and the Lord is gracious and giving them victory and at least security in their homeland. I know there are many theological views about whether the Jewish people today, what is their significance in theology. I submit to you this one thing: the people of Israel are God's people forever, because that doesn't necessarily mean that they're part of the church. That's a whole other theological commentary. But I do believe it's no accident that the Jewish people that live in the land, that still reading in Hebrew, praise the God of Israel in Hebrew, that God is not done with them, that God has a plan for his people, and that God is protecting his people. And while we just took 125 high schoolers to Washington D.C. 2 weeks ago, and one of the kids, I asked him what stood out to you, and he said, "What stood out to me is that we had the chance to bomb the concentration camps, the gas chambers, and for one reason or another, the Allies decided not to do that at some point. America just did. America just bombed the machine that was being built to destroy millions of Jews and stopped or at least pushed back by years another Jewish Holocaust. So I think we need to praise the Lord for that. I think we need to continue to pray for the hostages because this is not over. You're not going to see Israelis dancing in the streets for this ceasefire. Israelis are not going to go dance in the streets until all the hostages are back home and this war in Gaza is over. So just wanted to encourage people, please read Psalm 83, read Judges 4 through 6, and let us know in the comments your thoughts. Josiah, any reaction to that?
No, no, I think that's all good food for thought. I look forward to hearing people have to say in the comments if there are any reactions to that.
Well, thank God that we started doing this podcast around this time because I do hope that our alumni are being helped by this. Let us know if you have any thoughts, any questions. Josiah and I will probably do a question and answer episode soon or later.
Mhm.
Thank you for watching today. Please be in touch with us. Josiah, thank you so much. Can't wait to be back next week and see what's happened. Uh, please say bye to the people.
Yeah, sounds good. We'll see you next week.
See you next week, y'all. Thank you. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.